So today we are going to be looking at the original Leatherman SuperTool. Now this particular tool came out in 1994 and its production run ended in 2001. Now at the time this was released, the only two multi-tools that I can remember the Leatherman was producing at the time were the Leatherman PST, the original, which came out in '83, and then they had the mini tool. I think the mini tool came out in '94 if I'm not mistaken. It might have been a little earlier than that. But at the time, I believe those were the only two multi-tools in the Leatherman lineup. And so the SuperTool 300 had a lot of first to it. So first of all, it was the very first multi-tool that had came in the 4.5-inch frame size, or the heavy-duty frame size. It was the first that integrated wire crimpers. It was the first that integrated wire stripper. It was the first that had a standalone serrated blade, and it was the very first tool produced from Leatherman that had locking implements. So a lot of things that were very, very nice about the original SuperTool. Well, let's get into the specs, and I'll show you the tool set for this vintage Leatherman SuperTool. So again, the overall size of this was 4.5 inches. That is 114 millimeters in its closed position. The width on this, if we close it up, was 1.25 inches wide, or about 32 millimeters. And the thickness on here is actually a lot slimmer than what modern day versions of this tool are. It came in at 5/8 of an inch, or roughly 16 millimeters. Now, when we start going through the tool set of this, the first two tools on the outside, well, a tool and then a feature. First, the feature was much like they did with the PST. They had the lanyard loop on the outside of the tool. I kind of like that. Not because I use lanyard loops, but I like it because it's not taking up a tool slot as opposed to what they do in modern day versions of this tool. So it also had the integrated ruler, which was 8.5 inches or 19.5 centimeters, rulers that they still put on their tools today. But the fact that they're on the outside of the frame make them a little, just a little easier to use, in my opinion. So the pliers on here, and I want to bring the PST in here to show you what it was going up against at the time. And so you can see that the pliers on the SuperTool were a lot more robust than what you got on the original PST. Now, the early versions of these had very fine serrations on the needle nose portion. Then they included the wires, or the regular pliers, then wire cutters, and hard wire cutter notch at the bottom there. And again, this one was the first that integrated wire crimpers. Now, one thing I will say about these originals is that the vendor for Leatherman for their plier heads used to be located in the USA. And these early versions of tools were super, super smooth. In fact, they rival those of Victorinox multi-tools today. That has since changed. Now the vendor is located in Mexico, the last I knew. And their quality control is not what it used to be in these earlier versions. And so a lot of times you get a Leatherman tool that comes out fairly stiff on the pliers initially, and they end up breaking in quite nicely and become very smooth. But the originals like this one, they just came smooth right out of the gate. I mean, it was the quality control was a lot better when these were made in the USA. So if we look through the tool set here, let's start on the other side. So first we have the 420 HC blade. This blade is a little over 2.5 inches in overall length. And again, these were the first tools that had locking implements. So you notice that the joint here, the lock mechanism, actually has a little bit of a break. If we look at the other side, you can kind of see that a little better. So what it did is it engaged with the notches on the back of the implement. And so these actually locked in place. So in order to release them, because it doesn't have like a push lock like modern day, you have to take another tool out that will force that piece down, and then you can fold them over. So it was a little bit different of a lock mechanism, but again, it was the very first lock mechanism on Leatherman multi-tools. The next tool was their awl. Now the awl in modern day implements or modern day multi-tools from Leatherman is a lot more robust than this one, but it was kind of nice that they had an awl integrated into this particular tool. And then, like Leatherman has done many, many times in the past and continue to do today, they have a variety of different flat drivers. So you have this one's 3/16. This one is 1/4 inch. And then on the outside of this is where we have our file. Now, modern day versions of this tool, or these longer tools, are actually a little bit longer in the SuperTool 300 by about 1/4 inch. It's just the way the handle is broadened out a little bit. They're able to get a little bit longer tool, like the file and saw and the knife blades, than opposed to what the older versions were. So again, you had to pull out a tool in order to close that off. And then if we go to the other side, this was the first tool that integrated a standalone serrated blade. Now, unlike modern day tools where they usually have a sheep's foot blade for the serrated, these came as a clip point. But it was nice that they, especially for someone like me, because I actually use a serrated blade quite a bit, to have something like that on there. Then this was the year that they changed their combination tool. So it used to be just a combination bottle cap lifter, can opener, and then they lengthened it out and they added in the wire stripper to this. Now, I will say, in the method that I use these tools for, Leatherman tools for wire stripping functionality, it makes it a little bit more difficult to orientate. I like to take the tool, collapse it or close it back up, and then collapse this tool down on the body. That way you can stick the wire in there. With thumb pressure, you can twist the tool around the wire and the insulation on the wire to be able to strip it off better, as opposed to having it open and trying to force it down in there. It just doesn't work very well at all. But because of this lock mechanism, if you had it open, then you couldn't collapse it without grabbing one of those other tools and reseating it. So that was one issue with this. Though I will say that my first multi-tool was actually in '99. I went with the original Leatherman Wave as opposed to the SuperTool 300, but I debated for a while on which one to actually get as my first one. I think the selling point for me was the outside accessible blades made the difference. So the next tool that they have here is their Phillips driver. You'll notice that it has that long shank, which will allow it to get past these other interior tools. That way they can broaden the head out. Now, in modern day tools or modern day screwdrivers, Phillips screwdrivers for the SuperTool 300, and stuff like the rebar variants as well, they have a truss style screwdriver, which is a lot more robust. But I kind of like this older style because this is still a pretty good screwdriver. It was fairly strong, but because of the way they designed it, they do this in a number of tools. One that comes to mind is the Leatherman Crunch, where they're able to leave that shank more narrowed. Then they're able to nestle in some other tools a lot closer to it and thereby gain a tool slot in the end. So that kind of makes it advantageous. But the modern day screwdriver, Phillips screwdriver, is definitely stronger on the SuperTool 300. And then the last screwdriver that they have on here is a little 1/8 inch driver, which also works very, very well as a little punch down tool for electrical boxes as well. And then the last tool is the saw blade. Now, like I mentioned before, the implements on the modern version of this tool are about 1/4 inch longer, but this saw blade was still pretty good. It's more on par with the size of modern day rebar saws as opposed to modern day SuperTool 300 saws. And that rounds out the tool set for the Leatherman SuperTool. Now, I've pulled in the SuperTool 300, the modern day version of this tool, the more upgraded version of this tool, to highlight a couple of the key differences here. So obviously the plier head in the modern day tool is above and beyond what the older versions were. But looking at this plier head a little closer, you'll notice that to open this up, it has a more rounded back to the back of the pliers, and then it has the little raised portion that gets wider gets taller as you open it up. And so that's what locked the tool into place. It engages with the back of the handle here, and it gave you enough pressure in order to operate this. And because these were super smooth, you didn't have the problem of these collapsing on you. Where modern day versions of this tool utilize the same plier that they have in the Leatherman Surge. but they don't necessarily use, this is designed to broaden out the springs on the Leatherman Surge so that those springs will engage with the knife blades and thereby keep them from opening up whenever it's in the plier position. This one doesn't utilize that feature. It only utilizes the raised portion, and it's a little bit taller, and so when it locks into place, it has a lot more retention to it than what the original did. So the original, I can take it and you can break it over really, really easily. With the modern day, you have to give it quite a bit more pressure, probably about double the pressure in order to break it over. But because these pliers, I got a fly that just doesn't want to leave me alone. Because these pliers operated so smoothly, you didn't have to worry about this breaking over on you. Now, if it had a more weakened mechanism on the modern day versions, the stiffness of these pliers is a lot more, and then you would have an issue where they would be breaking over on you when you didn't want them to, is what I'm getting at. Then if we look at the body of it, you notice that in modern day, on the handles here, they make it quite a bit wider, and obviously the implements are able to make them a little bit longer because of that. The break is a little bit different, and they do that so that they can roll this edge. That way they can make the handles a bit more comfortable on the SuperTool 300, where the early versions of this, much like the PST, had that straight edge. And so they did a decent job of knocking the sharpness off of it, but you can still feel them when you're using the pliers. It creates a bit of a hot spot there. And you can see that the stance of the pliers when they're in their open position, or when you're using the pliers, the stance of the 300 stands out a little bit wider than what the original did as well. So in the end, this was a very, very good tool that came into the Leatherman lineup, being it was the first really heavy-duty multi-tool that Leatherman made. It was just a lot more robust than what the original PST was, and if we set them over the top, you can kind of get an idea of just how much bigger it was, how much more robust it was. A lot of those first were very good upgrades, like the locking tools, like the wire crimper, the wire stripper, a number of different things. I especially like the fact that it had that serrated blade in there, a standalone serrated blade, as opposed to a combo blade, because again, I get a lot of use out of those. Now, when I first got into multi-tools and bought my first one was in 1999, and I ended up going with the Wave like I mentioned before, but it was a very tough decision when it came to whether or not to get the SuperTool or the Leatherman Wave. I ended up going with the Wave like I mentioned before because for me the selling point was the quick access to the outer tools, especially the knife blades. And so in the end, that's why I went with the Leatherman Wave. But there was nothing wrong with the original SuperTool. In fact, my father carried one a few years before I even got my first one. And to this day, he still carries a SuperTool 300 as opposed to a Surge. I think more so because he likes the more original design of these tools, if you will. And I know a lot of people feel the same way. At any rate, this is the Leatherman SuperTool. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next one.